Alrighty, so I'm going to begin this week with a lecture on the House of Atreus. I believe your book actually refers to it differently. I think it refers to it as the House of Pelops, but potato patata. Um, I mean, essentially, it's we're talking about the same thing. What we're talking about is the descendants of Tantalus, um, who well actually I'm going to just really show you. So here are some of the names that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to be talking about Tantalus. Um, we're going to talk about Niobe again just for a second. Pelops and Hippodamia, Oenomaus. We're talking about Atreus, Areope, Diestes, Pelopeia and Aegisthus, of course, Agamemnon and Menelaus, their wives, Clytemnestra and Helen, who we've already talked about in who I mentioned in the Trojan War discussion. Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's children, Iphigenia, who we also have already talked about in the Trojan War discussion, but we'll talk about her a little bit more. Electra, Orestes, and then Menelaus and Helen's daughter, Hermione. So let's begin with Tantalus. So Tantalus is a son of Zeus. Like many of these mythological families, we begin obviously with Zeus. He is the king of Sipylus, which borders on Phrygia and Lydia. And because he is so he's so revered, he is allowed to dine with the gods. He does have two children, Pelops and Niobe. Again, Niobe should sound familiar to you. We have actually seen her before. So he is, like I said, allowed to dine with the gods, and at this meal, he decides that he is going to feed the gods a special meal, his son Pelops. And so he chops his son Pelops up and attempts to feed him to the gods. All of the gods except Persephone, or I'm sorry, except Demeter, who is still upset about Persephone being in the underworld. Basically, everyone realizes that they're eating human meat, not an animal, except Demeter. Demeter, not realizing what she was eating, eats a piece of Pelops's shoulder. The gods are able to put Pelops back together and to bring him back to life, except his shoulder, of course, is now being digested by Demeter, and so they give him a shoulder made of ivory. Because of this, Tantalus is punished. Tantalus is punished, and he is given one. He is one of these the souls that suffers eternally in the underworld, being forced to suffer eternal hunger and thirst. So the punishment fits the crime. So the eternal punishment is that Tantalus is stuck in a river with an apple or a piece of fruit hanging just above his head. When he reaches for the piece of fruit, the tree pulls the piece of fruit away from him, and he is unable to grab that fruit. He's also covered up to his chest in water. Whenever he reaches down to drink of the waters flow away, and he's unable to get a drink. So again, one of these eternal punishments that we see going on in the underworld. So that is Tantalus. And I should mention that Tantalus yeah, so that's Tantalus. So his two children, again, we've already learned about Niobe, um, who, of course, if we remember, boasted about how wonderful her 7 boys and girls were, um, and that she was better than Leto because she didn't have just 2 children, she had 14, 7 of each. Um, because of this hubris, if you remember, Niobe sends Artemis and Apollo down to kill the children of Niobe. Um, and they kill all 14 of these children. So here's and I should mention, I'm just going to get this out of the way right now because you're going to notice it as we continue. The house of Atreus, or the house of Tantalus, or the house of Pelops, whatever you want to call it, they are, this is basically, I mean, not even basically, this is essentially Jerry Springer. And actually, I think about that now, that reference might be lost um, on um, on you. I assume you know Jerry Springer, but this is the most dysfunctional family of the ancient world. Oedipus is bad. This one is worse. So, and especially um, in the cycle we're going to get in because of Pelops. But again, so now within a generation of the family being created, we already have the father feeding sons to gods, and then one daughter bragging about her children and having all of them murdered, in essentially ending Niobe's bloodline. Tantalus's other son, Pelops, like I said, is put back together by the gods, and his shoulder is replaced by a piece of iron. Pelops becomes dear to Poseidon, and so he is actually given a set of horses. Of course, remember Poseidon has this association with horses. This is the similar gift that he tries to give to Athens. If you remember the river and the horses that he attempts to give to Athens. We also, of course, have um, Pegasus, the winged horse that is born from Medusa, whose father is actually also Poseidon. So, because of this relationship with Poseidon, he has these 2 horses, and these aren't just any horses; these are the fastest horses on Earth. Um, Pelops needs, basically, is an age where he needs a wife, and so as he looks over the land and tries to find a wife, he decides that he wants to marry Hippodamia. Um, the only problem is Hippodamia. Her father has basically said that to win her in marriage, they have to beat him in a horse race. But if the challenger loses said horse race, they die. And so after a while, obviously the suitors stop calling for Hippodamia because Oenomaus also has very, very fast horses. Very, very fast horses. Pelops decides, well, I'm in love with Hippodamia. I'm going to give it a shot. But he decides that he is going to, rather than leave it up to chance, he is going to cheat. This is actually a really interesting uh, uh, depiction, actually, of the house of Atreus here. So anyway. So this is an interesting depiction of the whole family. I should actually Maybe I put this at the front. That's okay. Maybe I will for just the PowerPoint. Anyway, so basically, Pelops bribes Myrtilus, who is Oenomaus' charioteer. So I should mention, in the ancient world, very often the warrior would not. So this isn't like a chariot race like we see later in Rome, where it's one charioteer steers a chariot. Very often these chariots would have two individuals. You would have room for two. The charioteer, the person driving the horses, and the people throwing spears and using the weapons. And so Myrtilus is Pelops's charioteer. I'm sorry, not Pelops's charioteer, Oenomaus' charioteer. And Pelops bribes and promises, or bribes Myrtilus to replace the spokes in Oenomaus' chariot with wax. So the race begins, and as the chariot starts to go, what happens? The wax spokes that were there start to heat up, and what does wax do when it heats up? It becomes a soft. Because wax, which of course is very hard when it's when it's cool, becomes very soft, and the wheels fell off of Oenomaus' chariot. Oenomaus dies because he's hurt. If I remember right, he's hurt, and he dies because of this lost chariot race. Thus, Pelops is able to marry Hippodamia, but he is exiled to the Peloponnese, which is the where modern day Sparta is, which is the archipelago on the southwest of Greece, which bears his name. So so when Pelops is exiled, because of his betrayal, he brings about a curse on his family of killing his father-in-law to marry his wife. So it brings about this curse of bloodshed in the family. Not that we haven't already seen that already, but as we see, as in later generations, this is going to escalate and follow similar patterns so yeah, we'll get to that. So Pelops and Hippodamia have two sons, Atreus and Thyestes. Atreus, being the oldest male, is made the king of Mycenae, and he marries Ariope. Thyestes, however, wants to be the king of Mycenae. He wants to be the king of Mycenae. He doesn't much care about his brother and his marriage, and he sleeps with Ariope. In an attempt to be made king, Thyestes goes to his brother and says, "Hey, brother, I want to make a deal with you. I think whoever has a golden ram, they should be king. They should be king of Mycenae." Atreus, of course, thinks, well, perfect. I actually have a golden ram that I have kept hidden away. The only one that knows that is Ariope. This is like, I got this in the bag. What he doesn't know is that as Thyestes has slept with Ariope, not only has he called into question the legitimacy of Atreus's children, who we'll talk about here in a minute, he also has found out about Atreus's golden sheep and convinced Ariope to help him steal it. So here we actually have the representation of Atreus and Thyestes, and we have this golden sheep. When Atreus finds out what Thyestes has tried to do, he exiles Thyestes and his children and family from Mycenae. But this brings up an important issue, and actually one that when you, not that it, and I should say not that it's a justification for this, but it explains sort of why they're like, why people are like, why it's like this. But this sort of gives way to one of the reasons why why the Greeks were so sort of misogynistic and protective of their wives, and why they often kept them in the home. And it's because of the legitimacy of heirs. The legitimacy. Again, I'm not saying this is a justification for it. This is just the reason for it. But basically, now when Atreus finds out that Thyestes has slept with his wife, he no longer knows if Agamemnon or Menelaus are his children, or his rightful heirs. If you remember, if you remember going back to the discussion of Hestia before the midterm, basically in that ritual where they would pass the child, they would walk around the hearth and pass the child over the hearth, leaving up to the father to claim the child as his own or not. Right? If you remember that ritual. And so fathers are left to decide if their children are legitimate or not. And often, I mean, more often than not, the children are believed to be legitimate. But in this case, Atreus doesn't know. Unsure. He's unsure if they are or are not. Because of this uncertainty and because of his anger over what his brother did, he devises a plan to get revenge and satisfaction. Or I'm sorry, revenge and verification. Of course, satisfaction, revenge and verification. So he offers Thyestes peace, and he sends, believing that if his sons participate in this plan, they're clearly his. So he sends his sons Menelaus and Agamemnon to their uncle Thyestes, begging him to come back and saying, our father is not angry, his father is not mad at you anymore. He wants you to come back, and he wants you to help him rule. Thyestes doesn't want to help rule anymore. He's given up his ambition of ruling. He really doesn't want to go back, but his sons convince him that everything's going to be okay. Nothing wrong is going to happen. So what's Atreus's plan? So Atreus's plan is to lure Thyestes back to Mycenae in order to kill his children and to feed them to him. This is his solution to get revenge on his brother for calling into question the legitimacy of his children, sleeping with his wife, and trying to usurp him as king. Like I said, Atreus believes that if Agamemnon and Menelaus are complicit in this, this will mean that they are legitimately his sons. but they will prove they love him and not Thyestes. So a lot of and I should mention, a lot of what we know about this family, there's the play by the Roman author Seneca called the Thyestes, and that sort of like lays out this part of the story. But I mean, it's a common enough story already, but this is one of the remaining representations of it. At line 325, Atreus says, Agamemnon must serve my scheme knowingly, and Menelaus assists his brother knowingly. Let me gain assurance about my questionable issue from this crime. If they refuse to engage in this war of hatred, if they call him uncle, he is their father. They must go. So not only does he want Agamemnon and Menelaus to be participants, he thinks that at least Agamemnon has to be a knowing participant, and Menelaus also needs to know. So like I said, with the promise of part rule, and being convinced by his sons, in some versions he has 2 sons, in some versions he has 3 sons. The number is sort of inconsequential, unfortunately. He's convinced by his sons to return, but tells Atreus, I don't want to rule. I just want there to be peace between us. I just want to resolve this issue between us. That's all I want. Atreus is like, sure. Later in that day, Atreus, while Thyestes is sleeping, enacts his plan. Again, so if you remember, violence is performed off stage. This is actually the reporting of a messenger who's seen this, and he reports it to the altar. But this is how the scene is described. And now he just dismisses delays and takes a stand at the altar. So he does this over an altar, and I don't remember if it's in here, but basically, it's leading up to this. It talks about there's a place in the back of the palace where there's an altar that he does this in. It's a secret place. So he dismisses delays and takes a stand at the altar. He hesitates and takes pleasure in ordering the savage crime. First place, lest you think I'm lacking in family feeling, is dedicated to his grandfather. Tantalus is his first victim. So the oldest, and I should mention, the oldest son of Pelops is named Thyestes is named Tantalus. Tantalus is his first victim. The brute buried his sword in the wound he made, the hand meeting the throat as it thrust deep. When the steel was pulled out, the corpse stayed upright. After long hesitation whether to fall this way or that, it fell on his uncle. Then that savage drags Plisthenes to the altar and adds him to his brother. With a mortal stroke, he chops off the head. With the neck severed, the trunk falls forward, while the head rolls away, mumbling some intelligible protest. Holding a blade soaked in 2 killings, and regardless of the target of his rage, he drives it violently out beyond the body. Taken on the chest, the sword projects at once from the boy's back. He falls and dies from both wounds as his blood douses the altar fire. No age could believe such a crime. The future will deny it. Torn from the living chest, the organs are still trembling, the veins pulsing and the hearts throbbing in terror. Once the victims prove satisfactory, he relaxes and takes time for his brother's feast. With his own hands, he cuts and separates the bodies limb from limb. Just the faces he keeps, and the hands given in trust. So Atreus. So if we think about, I mean, to me, this reminds me so much of the rage that Achilles feels. We talked about in the Trojan War lecture. This rage that he feels, where he tells Hector that he's going to eat his children or eat his flesh. I'm sorry. No regard for life, no regard for the victim. It's like this blood trance, you know, I mean, it's hard to describe, but it's almost like this trance, this lack of humanity that Atreus feels. It continues. Atreus cooks the meat, and actually, I don't have that on here, but it's really interesting in the play when he attempts to cook the meat, the fire flees from the meat, unwilling to cook it at first. And it's almost like the fire has has cognition, because it's like the fire finally relents, realizing the role it has to play. But but the fire is reluctant to cook the flesh of the sons. Um, so he has his so he invites his brother to eat, not eating anything. He fills his brother's cup. He makes sure he continues eating food, right? And then he says, I am the highest of heavenly gods, the King of kings. I have surpassed my own prayers. He's stuffed. He imbibes pure wine from a goat, from a great silver cup. Do not stint your drinking. There still remains the blood of so many victims. The color of vintage wine will disguise it. Yes, let this be the cup to close the feast. Let the father drink the blended blood of his sons. He would have drunk mine. See, now he has raised his voice in festive song with little control over his wits. So Thyestes drinks the blood and eats the flesh of his sons unknowingly. Agamemnon then brings out a platter with the heads, I should mention Thyestes, wanting his sons to participate in the feast, asks Agamemnon to call them to him. Agamemnon, teasing him, says they're already here. Thyestes looks around, and Atreus brings in a platter with the heads and hands of Thyestes' sons, opens the platter, and shows them to Thyestes. Thyestes, disgusted and afraid, exiles himself, leaves the city, and Atreus remains the king, having gotten his revenge. This isn't even the start. I should say, this is just the start. This is just the start. But we're already getting pretty deep down the rabbit hole here. So eventually Atreus dies and leaves the kingdom to his oldest son, Agamemnon, who has proved his legitimacy to his father. Agamemnon becomes king, and he marries Clytemnestra. So if we remember the children of Tyndareus, right? Clytemnestra is born from the same egg as Castor and Helen from Polydeuces. So the two brothers marry these two sisters. We know what happens with Helen and Menelaus. We've already discussed that story. But Agamemnon marries Clytemnestra and has numerous children, one of which we've interacted with already, Iphigenia. But he also has a second daughter, Electra, and a son, Orestes. As we all know, he does lead these Agamemnon, because Paris has taken Helen from Menelaus, leads the Achaean forces against Troy. So we've sort of already discussed the sacrifice of Iphigenia at Aulis. So if you remember, Agamemnon, while hunting at Aulis, kills a deer sacred to Artemis. And this essentially prevents the army from being able to sail to Troy. Agamemnon is told for the soldiers for the troops to sail, Artemis requires that he sacrifice his daughter to her. Agamemnon, choosing a dedication to his men, to the army, to the state, over that of his family, agrees to sacrifice Iphigenia and tricks Clytemnestra and Iphigenia to come to Aulis from Mycenae with the promise that Iphigenia would be marrying Achilles. It's not until the moment before the sacrifice happens where everyone realizes what's going to happen. Well, Clytemnestra and Iphigenia. But Iphigenia, realizing what's going to happen, that she's going to be sacrificed, and realizing her father is not going to stop the sacrifice, willingly gives herself. In the play, it's got to be Euripides' play, Iphigenia at Aulis. It's actually, this scene is described where basically Iphigenia stares all these Greek soldiers in the face, and none of them are able to look at her, all ashamed, but none would stand up for her. Clytemnestra would come to resent Agamemnon for this. And that resentment, while the sacrifice gets Agamemnon to Troy, the resentment that Clytemnestra feels will cost him way more than what he gained. So the troops are able to sail to the Trojan War. So now we're going to put a bookmark in Agamemnon. He is away fighting at war. I mentioned in the first slide that Thyestes has another son. So basically, he has a daughter. His name is Pelopeia. After he is exiled from Mycenae a second time, he goes off into the wilderness and finds his daughter Pelopeia. He sleeps with her, and they have a son whose name is Aegisthus. Aegisthus comes to Mycenae and seduces Clytemnestra, and in so doing also convinces her to kill Agamemnon, which Clytemnestra agrees to help him do because she's still upset over Iphigenia. So Aegisthus's plan is to get revenge for his brothers who were killed, and to basically not only delegitimize any children that Agamemnon might have with Clytemnestra upon his return, but also to murder him swiftly upon his return. So we're going to fast forward. We're going to fast forward 10 years. Agamemnon returns from Troy. He's one of the first to arrive home. And most of what we know of this part of the story comes, and if you notice, I'm sort of piecing this together from all over the place, but what we know about Agamemnon's return comes from Aeschylus's play, The Agamemnon, and actually the sort of the gist of where we're going to go from here comes from Aeschylus's trilogy called the Oresteia, which consists of the Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Furies, or the Eumenides. So Agamemnon returns home with, if we remember, Cassandra, and all of his war prizes, all of his, right, his time, with all this additional kleos, right? Clytemnestra convinces him that she has been a dutiful wife the entire time he has been gone. And Agamemnon believes her because he has no reason not to. Clytemnestra convinces Agamemnon to basically commit an act of hubris by having him walk on a purple rug. She basically goats him into it, saying, well, what would Priam do? It wouldn't matter to Priam to walk on a purple rug. And aren't you better than Priam? You've defeated him in battle. You've taken his city. Agamemnon said, yeah, that's a good point. Does it anyway. He goes into the house, and we haven't really talked about this, and it's mostly because we didn't really get into this part of the Hercules myth where I would normally introduce this. But basically, as Agamemnon returns from war, and as any Greek would return from war, they would have what's called miasma, which is like this blood pollution, and there would actually be a process of washing this miasma off. And so often you would take a bath immediately when you got home, sort of purify and cleanse yourself of this miasma. So Agamemnon, who comes in to take a bath to sort of wash off this miasma, is lured into, gets into the bathtub. There, a sheet is thrown over him, and Aegisthus and Clytemnestra murder Agamemnon in his bathtub. One of the things that's interesting, and I should mention this, one of the things that's interesting in this version of the play is in Aeschylus's Agamemnon, is Agamemnon seems very different. So Agamemnon in Homer is very arrogant, and it seems like seems like the type of person that would willingly sacrifice his daughter to win a war. And I think that's consistent with what we see in Homer. But Aeschylus's representation of Agamemnon, he's not quite the same as we see in Homer. And there's definitely there seems to be some remorse in the chorus when it talks about, when Clytemnestra reveals about the sacrifice, Agamemnon seems a little bit ashamed of what he has to do, not really knowing what else to do. Um, Regardless, this cost Agamemnon his life. The anger of his all of essentially the sins. I shouldn't use the word sins. The actions in his life before the Trojan War, namely his participation in the killing of um, Tantalus or Thyestes' children, um, and the sacrifice of Iphigenia cost him his life. One of the things that's quite interesting in this is, so I mentioned this in the Trojan War lecture, but when Odysseus goes into the underworld, he encounters Agamemnon there in the underworld. So, if in case you haven't read the Odyssey, basically Odysseus is told that he has to go into the underworld and find Tiresias, who's going to tell him how to get home and what he has to do when he gets home to get there safely. So, how he can have a safe and sound nostos. Remember this term nostos, this return home. If we're, and this term in this going into the underworld is called a catabasis, and so and that's spelled Katabasis, catabasis. And as Odysseus goes into the underworld to find Tiresias, he encounters several of his former colleagues, including Achilles and Agamemnon. Achilles won't talk. Actually, it's interesting because Achilles won't even talk to him at first, but eventually does. It actually provides a very interesting quote where he's, basically sort of laments his decision to die there in Troy. And he's like, it's better to be the slave of a shepherd than to be the king amongst the dead. But anyway, so he encounters Agamemnon, and there he's like, Agamemnon, what's happened here? Like, you just got home. Like, how are you dead? What happened? And Agamemnon tells him, when I got home, my wife had been plotting against me with this guy Aegisthus, and he murdered me in my bathtub. But in Aeschylus's version, it's Clytemnestra who kills Clytemnestra alone who kills Agamemnon. And while that's a subtle difference, these are the sort of things that the Greeks would be expecting there to be some sort of change. And this is, when we talk about myth, like, this is why like canon or sort of these when myths sort of become when they become canonized or canonical, part of the issue is that the stories do continue to, like, the stories, like, we might tell a certain version, but it does change. And this is just although this is just a slight change, it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference. And it wouldn't be something the audience would be expecting. When the audience goes to see Aeschylus's Agamemnon, they would be expecting Aegisthus to be the one killing Agamemnon, not Clytemnestra. So this would be quite the buzz. Okay. So, and one of the things that I probably haven't emphasized enough, and I should, is what we see is, because of this continual bloodshed within this family, that essentially is, so remember I was mentioning that, like, Pelops is cursed. So this curse sort of goes with this, about this continuous bloodshed within the family. What's interesting in the Agamemnon, after Clytemnestra has done this, she comes out and she exclaims to the people of the city that she has cured the bloodshed, this and really this blood pollution of this house. Through killing, by being a member outside the house, killing Agamemnon. So she believes she has ended this. But guess what? She's wrong. She's wrong. So we're going to backtrack for a second. So if you remember, we have these other two children of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, who have not really, especially Orestes, has not been in the house while Clytemnestra has been carrying on this affair with Aegisthus. Orestes, who is away, is ordered, Apollo comes to him, and he is ordered by Apollo and Zeus to return to Mycenae and to kill Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. When he returns, he finds that Clytemnestra and Aegisthus are ruling Mycenae, and his sister Electra is being neglected. It's interesting, and this is really interesting in how this is represented, or how this is depicted, because Clytemnestra, who uses Iphigenia as her justification for killing Agamemnon, while yet her other two children, she just sort of rejects them and sends them away. So with the help of Electra, and actually I should mention, in some versions, it's Electra that does the killing, or they do it together. In Aeschylus' version, that's not the case. But Electra helps basically Orestes get in with Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, and he kills them both. What's interesting is that he kills Aegisthus. So these are actually two different representations of it. The one on the bottom left, we see Orestes wearing this traveler's hat, which is something we often see Odysseus wearing. He's not wearing in this large one, but here we have him stabbing Aegisthus, who he kills with ease. But when he has to kill Clytemnestra, she begs for his wife, or for her life. Please, I'm your mother. Don't kill me. I was just in killing your father. Things like, and she almost convinces. She almost convinces Orestes not to, but in the last minute, he is compelled by his companion, whose name I've left out here because it's not really that important, to do what he has come to do, and he kills his mother. Immediately after he kills his mother, and this is actually this great moment in these plays, but immediately after he kills his mother, he hears these voices of the Eumenides, or the Furies. And these are these super scary creatures who torment, avenge the murder of blood relatives. Supposedly, the depiction of the Furies was so scary to the Greeks when this play was performed that women started to miscarry, and people were just terrified. People were soiling themselves, and it was apparently quite scary. These creatures chase Orestes all over the land until Orestes arrives at Delphi. We're at Delphi. Apollo purifies Orestes. But the Furies continue to chase him. The Furies continue to chase him anyway. Although at this point he's been purified there in Delphi. He arrives, so Apollo tells him to go to Athens, because in Athens, they're good and just people. If we remember, this is being performed in Athens, right? They're good and just people there in Athens. He appeals to the people of Athens. Athena herself says, okay, we're gonna find out what's what. And on the Areopagus, Athena presides over a jury of 12. Sound familiar? This is where this is actually where the idea of the 12-person jury comes from, to basically decide the case, to decide what's going to happen. So there's a trial that ensues. What's interesting is, so the Furies give their case. Apollo acts as the defense attorney for Orestes and tells, I told him to do it. This was the will of the gods. And the final defense, and the one that convinces Athena, he says, and Athena, you know better than anyone, but of course, women aren't necessary for childbirth. They're just a vessel for childbirth. And Orestes can't be in trouble for killing his relative, because a child has no relation to their parent, to their mother, because she's just the vessel, the oven in which the child is baked in. Right. Yeah, I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. And unfortunately, Athena is convinced by this argument. She's convinced by this argument. And Orestes is acquitted of any further punishment. The Eumenides essentially agree to stop haunting these bloodletters, particularly Orestes, and they become honored deities in Athens. What's interesting is what this really is a story about, and I haven't gotten a lot into that either, but of course, this is giving us real institutions in Athens, the 12-person jury. What makes Athens different? Well, someone could go and people are going to listen to your case. Someone, fellow citizens are going to listen, and they're going to, I forgot the best part. The jury split 6-6, and it's actually Athena who casts the deciding vote. Even though in the play, it's she sort of implies, well, if the jury is split, then he'll be acquitted. She sort of plays her hand before the trial even starts. But anyway, but going back to this is basically sort of praising Athens, talking about the establishment of this trial by jury, where it's not always just an eye for an eye punishment, where people actually can listen and a punishment can be doled out, not just retribution for bloodshedding. And this, of course, is signified by the end of this bloodletting of this house. This house. So Orestes is acquitted. He's let free. We actually see him in the Odyssey come up later. He actually marries Menelaus and Hermione, Menelaus and Helen's daughter. It's their wedding that Telemachus comes upon when he's asking about his father. I do want to end because I haven't really talked about this, but because they're part of the family. So Menelaus, when he and Helen return from Troy, Menelaus forgives Helen, and they essentially become a regular married couple. We see it in the Odyssey where they're just sort of act like nothing happened. I don't know maybe if that's healthy or not, probably not healthy. But both Menelaus and Helen basically get to go to this thing called the Island of the Blessed in the Elysian Plain, which is sort of like the Greeks' idea of sort of paradise. And so what's interesting when you combine this with the Trojan War lecture, all of these terrible things that happen, all of these sort of all the deaths, all of the bloodshed, all of the tragedy, all of it that supposedly revolves around Helen. And in the end, the couple, the indiscretion at the core of that, Helen and Menelaus just get to go away and live in paradise, which is interesting. And in large part, it's because, in large part, that's because Helen, much like if you remember Oedipus, where Oedipus is apotheosized, gets to go finally relieved from his pain because of his constant trying to do what was right, but just never quite being able to do it. We see that Helen, because she has really no control. I mean, Artemis just is passing her around however she wants. Helen never has say who that she wants to marry Menelaus. She never has say that she wants to go with Paris. So because her fate was determined, and regardless of what she did or what she wanted, she was forced into this fate. She received essentially a just ending in the end. So that's all I have for the House of Atreus. Like I said, it's a strange house, definitely dysfunctional, way too much cannibalism, way too much children killing. It's an emotionally exhausting family, to say the least. It only took 5 generations for everything to be resolved, for all the curses and bloodletting to be resolved. But eventually it is resolved. So I'm going to go ahead and end there. I hope you enjoyed it. This is actually, I will mention, this is probably one of the most fascinating parts of Greek and Roman mythology that, for me, as I've, as someone who works with classical literature, a big part of why I started was the Iliad and the Odyssey, was Homer. But reading things like the play of the Thyestes, which is my favorite Roman play, and the Oresteia, which has the Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides, the Furies, is my favorite Greek plays. This story sort of like encapsulates a lot of my favorite Greek literature. Not that like you really need to necessarily know that, but this is always an interesting story to tell. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know. And I hope you enjoyed this, and I will catch you next time. All right, have a great week.